when it starts counting. Okay, welcome to the latest episode of the Red Pill Fiction Factory from a lovely sunny Yucatan, Mexico. My guest today is called Mark Marlow. He's from the USA and he's written a much sort of touted book called The Jackalopians, which is getting quite a lot of reaction on the internet I've been watching. Hi, Mark, how are you?
I'm great, Richard. Thanks for having me. I really enjoy your podcast, I want to say. So I've listened to a lot of your episodes. You've interviewed some really interesting people, so it's an honor to be here. Thank you.
Oh, well, that's really kind. It's a very modest channel, but I'm quietly pleased with progress. And now what we're getting is quite a flood of people who were interviewed, say, a year or 2 or 3 years ago, coming back on with their follow-up books. And it's really adds an extra dimension of pleasure watching them evolve in that sense.
Yeah, that's great.
So hopefully that will be applying to you. Jackalopians is your first book, is it, I presume?
It is my first book. Yeah, I have another book that I've written that I will be releasing probably this summer. It's on similar themes. We can maybe talk about that later. But yeah, I may be coming back to you once that's published.
That sounds good. Now, let's start where I always start, or try to, is a bit of your background. It can be as rough and ready as you like. It doesn't have to be very accurate. I know.
Yeah. So I can give a little bit of my background. So, yeah, as you said, my name's Mark Marlow. I wrote this book called The Jackalopians. It was published the end of 2022, I guess. And it's kind of like a COVID book. So it's kind of a story, kind of partially an adventure story, partially a comedy, partially kind of a philosophical disquisition on the meaning of the times that we live in. But I wrote this book a little while ago to kind of just capture basically my thoughts about the times. For those who haven't read it, which I would imagine is maybe many of your listeners, it's basically the story of a group of kind of conservative-ish young men, professional men, people who are outwardly successful, but still, based on just the nature of the times we live in, are kind of internally unhappy and unfulfilled, but who live relatively comfortable lives in Washington, D.C., and they meet to form this group called the Jackalopians, which is the title of the book. And the meeting, it's kind of like a silly LARP society, kind of like some of these, like an Elks Club or Knights of Columbus or something, but it's all formed around worshiping the jackalope, which you as a Brit might not know what that is, but that is, it's a real American thing that I think really captures a lot of the American spirit. I think people can probably see my avatar here on the screen, but that's what it is. It's a rabbit with antlers, and it's this kind of like silly roadside attraction thing there's you see when you're driving around like the American heartland, so South Dakota, Wyoming, these kinds of places. And so, yeah, the purpose of the book is kind of like these are guys who probably have generally the same political opinions as us, and they've latched onto this thing as a symbol of what America once was, and that's what I think the jackalope is. It's a symbol of the historic America, like the pioneer spirit, but also combined with a lot of just naive fun and corny humor. So they create this group to worship a jackalope. Things in the book then spin out of control. They get caught up in a lot of the crazy issues of the COVID and Black Lives Matter era, and then it's all kind of about their old journey towards self-actualization. But so that's the book I wrote. Myself, in terms of my own background, I don't know that I'm that interesting of a person. I am mid-30s millennial, also with a comfortable job. I have a career and a family and kids. But I was trying to, when I wrote this, really capture the spirit of the times that we live in, where even the best of us are facing a real sort of spiritual emptiness that there's no real easy way to grapple with.
Yes, it is a book that only came out sort of just over a year ago, and was obviously, because it includes COVID. And by the way, we have to be careful what we say about COVID on YouTube. So
Okay.
keep it general and not be too.
Okay, I'll hold it back. All right.
Because otherwise we get banned. So it's a very, very up-to-date and relevant book in that sense. It's an immediate book, and you get that feel from almost page one, and where you're describing a relationship between one of the lead characters and his girlfriend. And yeah, it is. I'm delighted that you picked this timeline, because what a timeline we live in. It's an absolute, I mean, Clownwell doesn't sum it up, Apocalypse doesn't sum it up, Revelation is somehow a cross between everything. And it's such great meaty material for a fiction writer, because there's just so much, everywhere you look, there's something either completely idiotic or completely tragic going on. And it's something that you use to your advantage very much throughout the novel.
Yeah.
Especially in regard to the lockdown, but let's go on.
Yeah, I think that's right. So I think part of the reason I wrote this was because other people just haven't written this kind of thing. And I think it's important to capture the times that we live in. If nothing else, then at least a snapshot of the time, because like there hasn't been much COVID fiction, at least not from any kind of right-wing perspective. Like COVID is not a huge it's not a huge element of the book, but it's always lurking in the background, and it's influencing a lot of the things that happen at certain times. But no one's really done that. I think part of the problem is when you're writing about the present day that the news cycle moves so fast that like by the time you're done writing, people have moved on to something else. So it's tough to write a book that holds like the test of time. So I think the way to get around that, you have to do it as a snapshot. So even now, COVID isn't really that relevant anymore. And a lot of these other things that they talk about in the book, like the riots, around like the Black Lives Matter riots, not really, like they were really impactful, but they stopped after Biden got elected. So like a lot of that is really a snapshot of the particular years where the book takes place. The book takes place partially 2020. Most of the action is in 2021, when it's just kind of the extending malaise, basically. Like I think kind of 2020 is the revolutionary year where all the things happened, but 2021 is just the year where it all kept dragging on. And so my book spans both, but it's more focused on the year 2021. But yeah, I think it's important to make a testament to the times we live in, and I think a lot of other writing and I understand why people want to do this. They don't want to be as expressly political. People think it's cringe to write books that are too directly political. Like people like you, they say you're like being like Ayn Rand or something, which I actually do not agree with that criticism at all. Like if I am like Ayn Rand, that is a great compliment, because this is a person who sold millions of books and influenced generations of people for better or worse.
Whenever can I jump in? Whenever I hear criticism, I think of Ayn Rand, I think of George Orwell, I think of Aldous Huxley, some of the biggest names of the 20th century in literature. None of them who took an explicitly left of centre or anything like that, even though Orwell arguably was left of centre. Yeah, they were explicit as you can be in Animal Farm and in 1984 and in Atlas Shrugged. And look at where they are in the sales, lists and success, and people are still talking about them, much more so than a lot of others. I agree, and we need more, especially actually. They were writing in a tumultuous century too, but ours is going to be no less tumultuous. And when things are tumultuous, maybe if we all lived in a green pasture with flowers blossoming and the bees bringing us their honey every morning, we wouldn't need to get too political. But I think at the times we live in, if you're not writing to say something political, I wouldn't really bother some of the time. Go on, sorry to interrupt.
Yeah, I feel exactly the same way. I wouldn't bother writing if I didn't have a statement to make. And I think actually a really good statement on this that influenced me as I was writing, George Orwell did write an essay. It's called Why I Write. It's pretty short, but he's talking about the reasons that motivate people to write. And he basically says that there are 4 reasons. that all probably mix in somewhat in each author's own influences. Like all of us are some combination of the four, but he says that one of them will always predominate. And I think this is really true. The reasons he gives are pure egoism. That's the first one. And yeah, I think that's certainly present in me. I think it's probably present in all authors, but just the desire to be remembered after you die, and just to make a splash. He talks about like an aesthetic sensibility. So like the love of a well-crafted sentence, which I don't write, in my book, it's mainly about trying to convey points. So like, I don't necessarily dwell too much on prose, but I think there are certain like nice, beautiful passages. So that's certainly present too. And then the last two are the most powerful for me, which were, one is to build a record. So this is what I was saying before, to actually leave like a testament to what the times were really about. Because if we don't do this, then bad people will do this. And they're going to be the ones who write the history books and say that this is what like George Floyd and the Black Lives Matter riots and Donald Trump and all these people were really like. So we need to build our own record of the actual truth. And then the third one is political, which he says, people, when they hear that, they think, oh, you're doing party propaganda. But he says, and I have this in front of me, he's using the word political in the widest possible sense. So, quote, desire to push the world in a certain direction, to alter other people's ideas of the kind of society that they should strive after. And that is kind of the political sense, I think, that I'm writing in, where I want to describe the world, describe the world as it is and as it could be. That's really what's driving me to write.
Yeah, well, very well summarized. Going back to the third of those points about the capturing or building a record of our times, the book, your book, is excellent in that respect. We're talking about things that happened sort of 18 months ago, 2 years ago, and yet reading it in physical form, in a novel, it's stunning how A, distanced we are from it, but B, how hysterical and insane and so on the whole thing was. And it's not until you sort of see it in print, somebody else's interpretation of it, that your brain starts to ricochet around, because we were all like the frog in the boiling water at the time, not quite sure what was happening, and drifting along with the currents and all, and the message from the mainstream, and well, some of us made a stand, but it was all very chaotic and difficult to get a cold, clean, objective look at. But the way you set it in stone, if you like, is excellent, and it makes you appreciate that much more. But also, it struck me very much on your point, is in 100 years from now, or 1,000 years from now, people will be wanting to understand the COVID epoch, whether it's better or worse, we'll call it that. And unless we have set out writing in stone, so to speak, it is going to be very difficult for them. Even to understand an honest interpretation is going to be difficult for them. So we need to get it out in that sense for future generations, because what went on is so surreal. It's like the going on of a madhouse, that it will be very hard for anyone to believe it.
Yeah. Yeah. So I think that's really important. And I think that's why we do need to build a record. It is. I mean, it's tough. It's tough in a way to talk about, because I don't want to necessarily exaggerate, because, like caricature doesn't always work with the times that we live in, because like the actual people are crazier than the caricature.
Yeah.
But what I've tried to do in the book is just lay it out in sometimes just dry, straightforward prose, like what actually happened and what these people are like, and not really comments, but just kind of let it speak for itself about how insane this is.
A good example is you have the relationship at the beginning with Dan Smith, isn't it, and his girlfriend,
yeah.
And he swallows the whole COVID thing, hook, line, and sinker. And here we have your typical horny early 20s or whatever he is, dating a hot girl, and he doesn't want to sleep with her. He says, "No, we can't. Get away from me," sort of thing. It's never happened in history like that.
Yeah.
War, famine, plague. I don't think anyone's that age has ever shunned sex on an ongoing basis, as far as he's concerned, because he doesn't know what's coming.
Yeah.
And it's almost paradigm shattering what went on in our daily lives, and it did happen like that.
Yeah, yeah, and presumably he thinks in that time that they're gonna, because this is the very beginning of the pandemic, so he thinks that it's just going to be the 2 weeks to flatten the curve, and then they'll see each other again. But yeah, I mean, and people have criticized that part for being unrealistic. I actually think anybody who thinks that that's unrealistic has maybe lived in different areas that I've lived in, because that is how people acted. It's tough to imagine, but young men were all about, like, they would definitely do that. They were all about the need to socially distance and to follow the science and everything, and would certainly have reacted the way he reacted in that scene. I mean, he's thinking that they're going to be able to meet up again. Part of this is also being young and not really understanding women and like the chain of causality, that like once you reject her in this specific time, you can't just pick it back up again like 2 weeks or a month, or I think in the book it's like 3 months later, the pivotal moment of decision has passed and you can't undo that. So a lot of it is just being naive, but I think a lot of people did act like that.
Oh, sure. There are people still in the newspapers. I know they're not typical, but they're still incels and not coming out of their houses very much, and wearing masks and not kissing anyone and stuff. So I don't think it's extreme at all, the example. Now, a very strong selling point to me is that throughout the book, it's not just a story, a good sort of fast-moving story where you're dragged into this guy's daily life and so on, but you take quite a few opportunities in the narrative to introduce some of your views on certain things, or just to describe the world we're in. We've got the legal firm that Dan works for. I love this. It's quite, I think so, even on the first page, maybe, or the second or third page.
Yeah.
Great little summation of modern corporate life. And I'll just give you an excerpt, the reader an excerpt to whet their appetite. The legal firm is interchangeable with lots of others lining I and K streets past the White House, just another law firm recruiting the top students from the top law schools, paying them exorbitant salaries, and then putting them to work defending drug manufacturers against liability for causing mass birth defects, all while publicly asserting, in the most ostentatious terms, a commitment to the fundamental values of anti-racism, gender equity, and LGBT rights. Its attorneys are all either social climbers, workaholics, or diversity hires, all churned through the same system that produces the same people with the same interests. Those interests include volunteering to give legal aid to organizations that resettle gay Haitian refugees in Idaho. Yes, well said. Isn't that just the way it is?
Yeah.
Especially in light of COVID, of course, and the way that these wonderful pharmaceutical manufacturers have done the whole thing.
Yep. Yeah, I think that is definitely what corporate America is like right now, and I think that's the first page of the book, as you say. So yeah.
And sets the scene well for the context that we're in. And again, it's just a kind of madhouse that we're in.
Yeah.
Now, the main character, or the lead character, let's call him, because he plays second fiddle at some points to another character. But is he modelled on you at all, or is he a straw man that you can use?
No, he's modeled on me, and I of course I'll maybe get dragged for that, but I should add, of course, multiple caveats that none of the things that happened to him physically over the course of the book have happened to me. I met my wife like shortly after I graduated college, and so we've been together a long time now, and so none of that stuff. I didn't embarrass myself the way he embarrasses himself throughout the book, but at the same time, I think his inner struggles are, I think, a reflection of my own inner struggles. The way he's trying to face the meaninglessness of the world and to find meaning, and also just to find friendship and camaraderie. So part of it is also when he's just some lonely guy working at a law firm that's all just a bunch of people who, if they knew his actual political beliefs, would hate him and probably fire him. He doesn't have a good relationship with his girlfriend. It's good at first, but there's nothing underneath it. All they do is have sex. They are not connecting in any way. And then when she gets the opportunity with COVID, she leaves him and just like cheats on him with a bunch of other guys. So like there's not, it's that quest for kind of friendship and meaning that he then finds when he meets up with these people, the Jackalopians, who it's also, that's obviously not a fully realistic thing, but it's like a type of group. It doesn't really matter what they're even meeting to talk about. They're just getting together to do something in a time where people weren't allowed to even meet. So he is based on me, which is kind of embarrassing to say because he does do a lot of very embarrassing things throughout the book. But it's mainly though it's all just kind of the outward action of the book is really just a concrete manifestation of the drama that I see kind of within my own soul. But yeah, so that's the long answer to that. The character of Haji, who's the other important character, is also based on me. But he is a much different outward character, but his
your alter ego maybe or something.
Yeah, his views and his general trajectory internally and kind of converting or reconverting to the Catholic faith are kind of also based on mine.
Right. Daniel describes himself, intellectually at least, I fancied myself as an underground right-wing intellectual. I read books by the likes of Joseph de Maistre and Thomas Carlyle and James Burnham. I had well-considered, nuanced views on culture and society, far from the liberal slop that my co-workers slurped up from the New York Times and CNN. I was heartened by that paragraph because it's nice to see names like that appear, James Burnham and Thomas Carlyle, in text that's not to do with an intellectual essay commentary magazine or something. We need to generally, gently as well, bring in these people, these ideas, concepts from the sort of more esoteric wing of our intellectual into the mainstream. I think it's great that you're doing so.
Yeah, I think so too. And I mean that passage is a little bit ironic. It's kind of him being a little bit pompous and talking like promoting, because he's the narrator, so he's pumping himself up a little bit, and his actions don't always match his inner thoughts and his own like high conception of himself. But yeah, I mean those are all people who were influential to me, and so yeah, I try to make those kind of references and to try to boost the types of things that interest me where I can in the book. I mean, even writing a book that's about relatively conservative young white men is something that's not really allowed anymore either. So I've tried to do all those kinds of things where I can.
Yeah, I don't think you included enough minority characters, I'm afraid.
No.
Strike you down for that lot. There's so many good little inserts that I can quote from. Here's another one. He's talking about the girlfriend that he's going out with, who is a classic libtard. He's obviously not. So he sits there and he says, I sat there flummoxed. How could the nice girl I picnicked with get taken in with such stupid bullshit? This is the sort of liberal stuff that she hears all the time. I thought it over for days and none of it computed. Even then, at the age of 25, I still did not realize that there are people in this world whose stated beliefs have nothing to do with their actual thoughts, or that among them there are many more who will only lash out at you all the more cruelly the more they sense their own hypocrisy. Beautiful, beautiful passage. And similarly on libtards, he says, just when the country seemed like it couldn't get any crazier, I consoled myself with the idea that eventually reality had to intrude and that a system this insane could not last forever. And I say amen to that, and I think it's true. But yes, for these reasons and many others, I recommend the listener get a copy. And it's quite funny in times. Obviously, there's lots to laugh at, but at times it's quite intellectual and stimulating in that sense.
Yeah, I try to do both. And I think it's important to do both because I think it's important to have a sense of humor about the times we live in.
Yeah.
So it's definitely not all. It's not all like political messaging. I think there is a strong plot to it, and I try to intersperse the political message throughout. But yeah, I mean, there's a lot to it, and a lot of it is just like mocking the times that we live in. And yeah, I think that's important. There's really the sense, it's like the old Marx quote about how history repeats first as tragedy and then as farce. I think that's really what we're living through. Like the Soviet Union was the tragedy. Now these people have come back, and what they're imposing on us is really the farce. So there's a lot of really insane stuff that's going on, and it's important to point it out. And it's important to point it out from a moralistic perspective, like how evil it actually is, and not to give in on that, not just to purely treat it as a joke,
Yeah.
because it's not a joke. Like even some of the most insane aspects, like the trans stuff, it's funny in a certain sense, but they're really destroying people's lives. And these are kids. The people who are doing this are kids. They're people who don't know any better. They may regret it later. And I would not treat any of that as a joke, but it's important also to treat it. You have to have a sense of humor about it, and you have to really mock these people because there's like, I don't know, another quote, I forget who said this, but the one thing that Satan hates most is to be laughed at, because his great sin was the sin of pride. And I think that is, I actually may use that quote in the book, but I don't remember. I might at the end, but regardless, like it is really the people who rule us are really prideful, and they hate to be mocked. And really, humor is a powerful weapon, because there's not really much you can do when somebody's just making fun of you.
Uh,
Like you can't respond with more seriousness. So it is important to use
and
comedy.
as importantly is the reaction. When people laugh, they can't help it. So you've
Yeah.
broken through the taboo and everything with that moment. That's why a lot of the best stand-up comedians in the past, not allowed anymore, but they broke taboos, because that hearty laughter was proof that they were right. But you couldn't say it anywhere else outside of the theatre. No, I think you've hit two very important nails on the head. We must mock them. It is a bizarre time. It is a time of farce and worse. And laughter is the best medicine, as they say. But at the same time, there comes a time when the laughter goes, has to stop. There's probably my favourite passage in the book, coming onto that theme, is the two of them are debating about what's the nonsense that's going on, and it is nonsense, no question. But then he says, I can't help but think that there's still something more to it than that. That even though you're right on the basic issues, you're still thinking too materialistically, he said. He wondered how best to express himself and went on, I can't shake the feeling it's not just the left that is trying to steal our country. The extent of the evil around us seems just too big, too systematic for that. As I look around the world, I am starting to think that we're facing a greater, even more malicious power. That the destruction we see is the work of a much more ancient enemy, one who is trying to steal not just our country, but also our souls. Wow. Now, let's get into religion, because religion plays a part in the story. And I know that we delayed this chat a little bit because you were otherwise engaged on a Sunday morning. So I'm certain it's an important part of your life, and you're addressing it more or less directly there.
Yeah. So the religious aspect is possibly the most important aspect of the book. I think, just taking a step back for those who haven't read it. So there's two main characters. There's Dan, who is the primary narrator, and then there's Haji, who is the person who leads this group that's called the Jackalopians. And his name is Haji, but that's just his name, that's like his title within the society. It's like another LARP where they're copying the Muslim practice of people, someone who has a Muslim who has traveled to Mecca is called a Haji. In the same way, in this group, someone who has traveled to the city of Wyoming where the jackalope was created is also called a Haji. And so his real name is James, and he is a descendant of like the English Cavaliers, like basically the most noble, the most noble lineage of Europe come to America, but who is kind of a founding stock historical Catholic. His family were people who came over following the English Civil War and settled in Maryland, and he's kind of this like a person of noble blood, but who now works at a place called Inventive Solutions, just doing like nothing. And so part of the through line of the story is kind of his fall away from the Catholic faith, where he was like very pious as a young boy. He wanted to go to Catholic school. He unfortunately chose Georgetown, which I have nothing personally against Georgetown. I didn't go there. But it's like, the book takes place in DC, and it is a Catholic school that I think suffers from the issues described in the book. And then once he goes to Georgetown, he realizes, okay, this is nothing like the Catholicism that I grew up with at all. It's all just, it could be any other school. And then he meets a priest who is also a libtard and just spouts, spouts with pretty clear heresy, if not blasphemy, trying to say that Catholicism is basically just modern day progressivism, and that this then causes Haji to lose his faith, which ultimately ends up with him kind of drifting around through nihilism and then founding the Jackalopian Society as basically something else to do and kind of a substitute for this lost faith, which obviously the book is saying it's not really a substitute at all. Nobody should be going out worshiping jackalopes, but it is kind of at least in the modern times, it's not an insanely out there response. It's kind of like you just create some new meme ideology of something else to fixate on because you don't have like the broader thing really in your life anymore. And so then the book kind of tracks along his own progress towards recovering his Catholic faith. And I think one of the thing you just quoted was one of his speeches at some point in the book, talking about how really his exposure to the modern world and seeing how bad things really are, and basically understanding America as a world without God, that you really start to see like the actual presence of the devil, and that was bringing him back towards towards being able to kind of see the old truths of his childhood, and pushing him more into returning to Catholicism. And really that is, like you say, again, a lot of the characters are based on me. It is really a similar trajectory to what I've had. So I am a Catholic, like you said. It's Sunday morning, Sunday afternoon now, but we delayed this because I was at mass this morning. But like, I was not raised a Catholic. I'm a convert, and I think that probably comes through in my book, because like a lot of it, I mean, there is some vulgarity in the book. There's some things that really a pious cradle Catholic might not actually say. I do have kind of a convert sensibility, I think. But I was raised, like I was born in a very liberal area, to a very liberal family. Like all of my family are libtards, and I get along with them fine. But so when I'm attacking people in this book, it's not necessarily because I am just some guy from the heartland who just like loves Trump and hates liberals. Like I live and breathe this world, and some, like my own parents are, extreme liberals, and raised like I wasn't baptized until I was like 30. So so a lot of the talk about kind of feeling the pull of the Catholic faith, but not really understanding if it's something that can break through and pull you out all the way, whether it's something you can actually commit to, and really having to experience how the modern world is before you can actually commit to it. Not just on an intellectual level, but on like a deeper emotional and spiritual level, is definitely the process that I've felt my entire life. And so like Haji, even though he's different because he's a cradle Catholic who then loses his faith and comes back to it, it's the same basic process that I went through of like coming to it in the first place.
And it almost goes without saying, I imagine, that you see a similar kind of trajectory that you've described on an individual basis, both yours and the characters, is the way for society as a whole and for many more of us to find a solution to this mad world, to keep us sane, but also to find a way out in practical terms from the nihilism and the despair that sort of inundates our daily lives. Is that?
Yeah, I think so. I think if there's any theme to the book at all, I think it's really the theme of like how the individual can rise above the modern world. And I don't even, I mean, so for me, that's Catholicism. But I don't necessarily think you have to be a Catholic to read or like the book. And I don't even think that the real message is that everybody needs to become a Catholic. I think it's talking about it within the context of the characters in the book, and that is the way Haji was able to, that's kind of that's where the times led him to regain his ancestral faith. But I don't think I'm saying that everybody should do that.
No, I didn't mean to imply that everyone should be a Catholic, but it's religion as much as anything, or a third, or even just faith in.
Yeah, no, and I didn't think that you were doing that, but yeah, I think so. Yeah, certainly part of that is about kind of recovering a faith, or just even if not faith, kind of like a more ancient vitality and a willingness to kind of to return to deeper truths than we have right now. So then the final chapter in the book also, it's talking about Dan and kind of his reaction after like hearing about all the things that Haji went through, because a lot of the book is told in the form of like him hearing this whole story about like Haji's trajectory. And so some people have interpreted that last scene as that it's then Dan also converting to Catholicism. I again don't really think that that's exactly right. I don't think it's spelled out in the book that that's exactly what he's doing, although he is at a church and he's looking at a statue of the Virgin Mary. So it's not an unreasonable interpretation, but I think it's really what it's basically saying is that he, through this other person's example, is kind of himself being called to something higher than just to be like a modern bug man who just only wants to have sex and just masturbates and works, which is what he was doing before that. So yeah, I mean, I do think that like we need to rediscover a faith, and that the work, like the problem with the modern world really is an issue of faithlessness, and that all these things like the worship of Black Lives Matter and Dr. Fauci and George Floyd, that this really is just stuff that's come in to fill the void left by the loss of Christianity in American life. But whether that faith is Catholicism or something else, I think is probably ultimately left up to the reader. For me, it's Catholicism, and that's why I made the somewhat unusual choice to make Haji a Catholic. I think one criticism that I've actually never heard, but would be valid, is that really he should have been, since this is a book about America, he should have been a Protestant. Instead, he's this really hyper niche type of Catholic who were like among the early settlers of Maryland. That this is really not indicative of America itself or like the trajectory of what America could be. But I think the reason I felt like I had to make him Catholic is that I don't quite think, and no offense to anybody, because I do like Protestants and I think most of them are good people. I don't think that Protestantism is really a strong enough faith to do what needs to be done and to really recover everything that is lost. So that's why I had to make him Catholic.
Very good, very well put, very interesting, very stimulating. That's the sort of idealistic version, what we need to do. Do you think it's realistic? Do you think it can happen? And if so, what are the circumstances that will bring about? Because we don't see at the moment, I don't think, any uptick in church attendance or...
No, yeah, I don't really think it's realistic. Don't think it's likely to happen. I think probably, I mean, so this partially also why I try to be funny in the book, because I think I don't really see much hope for America, really, like in any kind of realistic way. I kind of feel like everything is really bad, and things have really been lost. There, you see all the people pouring over the border, just completely changing the makeup of the country. And then the people who are already here, like, have no conviction and I don't really see any indication towards large scale recovery of faith. I think there are a lot of there are certain indications, like some people are saying that the Zoomer generation tends to get things a little bit more, and that the people that the Zoomers there who are more right wing are more religious than like the right wing millennials, and kind of understand the issues more. But it's such a tiny sliver of the population.
For every video you see or report on that, you then switch on Twitter and watch other of their generation doing TikTok videos where they stick a knife in a toaster or something, and you think, this is not the generation that saves us. But I am actually much more personally optimistic. I like the quote that you said, that any system that's is so crazy, eventually reality has to intrude, and something better will come out of it. I just think things haven't quite reached that point yet. But I do think you'll find that religion makes a huge comeback. We've seen it actually in Russia and Eastern Europe since the fall of the Berlin Wall. They were forced into atheism for 70 odd years, and the moment they were given things reached critical mass and they broke free, the church attendance has gone through the roof. They're all very pious, and I don't know, it's not a cut and dried yet, but obviously there's a long way to go, and I may well be very wrong. I find it absolutely fascinating that you say your family are all, in your words, not mine, libtards and so on. It's a question I always ask guests, how they became red-pilled. I think it's going to be more interesting, and your answer is going to be more interesting than most, because most of us tended to come up in red-pill families and just follow the foundation. So how did it happen?
Yeah, and I think it's weird because I've always been some type of conservative, even though I came from a really liberal family. And so, I've been thinking about this. I think, so my trajectory, basically, like, I was always, my family is very liberal. My family, they're historically Catholic and Irish. So it's not as though Catholicism is like an alien faith to me, but at least my parents' generation all just completely rejected it. So this is a boomer generation. All, like, I have aunts who are involved in like actual communist politics, and like we're relatively involved. My parents weren't as much, but still like very liberal. And so, but I still, even though I don't think I'm actually a disagreeable person, I think in normal life I'm very mild mannered and nice, but I never really accepted all of that. And so, like, I came, like, one of my first real kind of political moments was 9/11, which happened when I was in high school. And that kind of pushed me to be, like, probably a lot of relative, like, healthy men with healthy instincts. It kind of pushed me into kind of a hyper patriotism, which, when I then went on to college, I think refined and intellectualized that a little bit better. But got really into libertarianism. I was reading Ayn Rand in college. Got really into that. I think that influence is probably a little bit. You can probably see that some of that influence in my writing. But I became libertarian. I was just interested, though, in lots of different strands. So I had a professor who was very based, and who knew a lot of these, like, very old too. He knew like a lot of the old school conservatives, and told me to read this guy named Hans Hermann Hoppe, who is a very interesting libertarian thinker. And so I did that. And Hoppe is interesting because he's kind of a bridge between libertarianism and conservatism. Once I read that, I started getting into other things like Moldbug and Paul Gottfried. Also, like, the people listed in the beginning of the book, like James Burnham and all of that. And so I was always kind of just like stewing in that intellectual world. And it was then later, kind of after I graduated college, I was getting my advanced degree, and I was more exposed to a lot of these like real libtard people. And this was even still pre-Trump, so it wasn't as bad as it became. But I started to realize like these people are actually really bad, and it was like the very beginning of the woke time. And so I started to realize like, okay, these people, it's not just because I always like, I'm like Dan from my book, I kind of see it all as like an intellectual thing to work out. But it's like, it's that quote you read. It's that it's not just that they disagree, it's that they're just lying and are manipulative and bad people. And ultimately, I now believe like influenced by Satan, like maybe indirectly, but it's a satanic, like a satanic depth of just hatred and evil and resentment towards like any kind of normal world. So that was kind of when there were all these strands mixed together, but that was the moment really when I was like, okay, libertarianism is not really what we need right now. We need more of a return to kind of conservative values. So that's how I became conservative. The Catholic thing also, it's all going on kind of at the same time. I became I actually finally took the plunge and converted to Catholicism much later. So I was like always very politically well-read conservative person. But it's tough to take the actual plunge into faith. So it wasn't really until a little bit later, like when I was 30, that I actually decided that, okay, now I really need to convert and become Catholic. And like now I'm practicing Catholic. I go to mass every Sunday, raising my children in the faith, all of that. And it's the reasons of me converting to Catholicism, I think, are kind of spelled out in the book.
Yeah. So fascinating, excellent discussion so far as I'm concerned, very enlightening. You say you've more or less written the next book?
Yeah,
tell me about that?
I have. Yeah, so I'm really excited about this too. I don't want to say too much about it because I don't want to spoil it. Not all of it is ready to be released. But it's a book that covers very similar topics in a similar style, but with a completely different plot. So I think the way I've been thinking about it recently is like if the Jackalopians is talking about how the individual can triumph over the modern world, my next book is talking kind of about society itself. It's like a little bit more allegorical. It's talking about how we got to the place that we are. But the general plot, like the actual core of the action, is the hero is a Catholic priest, and he is trying to make his way across the landscape of modern America, to give like the final deathbed confession to his childhood friend, who is a very famous, well-known sinner who now wants to like repent from a life of evil through this deathbed confession. So the story is following the priest across America as he gets involved in many outrageous things. So like if you've read the Jackalopians, you can imagine I don't ever hold back. Like I leave nothing on the table. Lots of insane things happen. I think it's just as funny, just as outrageous as the first book. But like, yeah, that's a basic story. So it's kind of like an odyssey across America. Again, somewhat like the Jackalopians, where it's not like a linear story. It kind of shifts back between the present and flashback. So it's all about like this chase across the eastern seaboard to find this guy to give him confession. At the same time, it cuts back a lot to their life and like how they came to be in the place that they are now across the landscape of a radically changing America.
Wow. So it's set in present day America. It's not post-apocalyptic like some stories would be in this context.
No, it's technically,
Maybe we
it's
are.
like, well, yeah, I think we are kind of post-apocalyptic, but it's like 10 years in the future, but at least in the book, like nothing really has changed other than things are just, maybe like 10% worse than they are now. But it's not post-apocalyptic. It's really like a present day
I
story.
think you're being presumptuous in thinking that the US of 10 years from now will not be that much changed. It might not even exist. We'll have to see.
Yeah.
Okay, well, that's something to look forward to. Do you have a title, or can you tell us? Or
I'm working on the title. Yeah, the working title has been Absolve Him, with an exclamation point at the end, which I do like as like kind of like a funny action title. I don't think it quite works with what I want to convey, so I probably will change it around. But that's what it'll be. It'll be something along those lines. And I think I'm aiming to release the book sometime this summer, so like July or something, so people will be able to read it at the beach if they want.
very good. You opened the first book, The Jackalopians, with a quote by Kipling. I'm a big Kipling fan. It's a quote I didn't recall, and it was from a story I didn't know about. It's a short story called The Jay Knights. Is that right?
Yeah.
And could you just give some context to the choice of Kipling and why The Jay Knights?
Yeah, so this is probably the most direct influence for me writing the book, The Jackalopians. Kipling wrote this story, The Jay Knights, which is about it's about like soldiers trying to cope with life in the trenches during World War One, and it's told in kind of a similar format to the Jackalopians, where this guy is meeting a member of this society who's like telling him about what it was like, and he was a soldier in the trenches, and then when he was there, he met this kind of wacky group of other people who had this secret society with all types of weird initiation rituals. But in their case, they're British soldiers. It was all about Jane Austen. So
Yeah.
it's a funny story. It's short, like everybody should read it. And I read it at the time. This was like during the COVID years, and I just kind of wondered, what would this be like if I took this story and put it in America? So that's how my book came to be. I don't know. I like Kipling a lot. I don't necessarily think he influences my style that much. My book is completely different, other than that core of the idea.
Who would you liken your style to? I asked myself that several times in the reading of it, and it's fairly unique.
Yeah, I think there are a few different strands. So another thing that was really influencing me at the time was I was reading a lot of Charles Dickens. So this was also COVID, when I had a lot more free time, and I read a lot of Dickens books, and I started to think that like this is the type of thing we need more of now, like books that are just nice and fun to read and uplifting. Like even people criticize Dickens for being too maudlin or emotional sometimes, but I really think that that's kind of what is needed now, especially when we're in dark times. It's nice to be able to read something like that. So that was kind of an influence in crafting the style. Other people, like Graham Greene and Evelyn Waugh, are two people who influenced me a lot. People who write exciting action books, but that are also dealing with big issues of faith and politics. So they influenced me a lot. And then another person who doesn't get talked about a lot, but I think is very good and worth reading, is this guy. His name's Charles Portis. I don't know if you've heard of him. He's like, he was most famous for writing the book True Grit, which became the movie with John Wayne.
I've read him. Yeah.
And he writes actually a lot about Mexico too. So he's very funny. He wrote a book called The Masters of Atlantis, which is about also secret societies, that I read at the time I was writing this book, to try to just get like pointers about how to depict a secret society. And I think some of that influence comes through the way he does humor and dialogue. Has kind of influenced my style to some extent too. But yeah, I think it's all of those kind of different strands have come together to form this book.
And what a book. Well,
yep.
Congratulations. Thank you very much for writing it. And thank you for coming on the show. I think we got a lot out of that, and it was fascinating to hear. So
yeah, well, yeah, it's been an honor. Thanks for having me. I really enjoyed it.
I look forward to hopefully being able to get you back at some point. We'll talk about the next one.
Yep.
In the meantime, all the best, Mark Marlow.
Thank you. Bye.